Good day, everybody. Randy Franklin Smith here, and we have just got an awesome technical hacky event today. And I've got some other really smart guys with me. We're going to look at this from multiple points of view. And I tell you, this exploit is just interesting in so many ways. It's, first of all, something to really nerd out on, but it's also something much bigger than just F5. This is a perfect example of the kind of exploits that are just sitting out there latent, ready to be utilized by the bad guys. And we'll talk about why. And of course, we'll talk about what can we do about it. Now, today's Real Training for Free is made possible by Immersive Labs and Randori. And some of you might remember Kev from the last time we did an Anatomy of a Hack webinar. Kev, it's great to have you back, and looking forward to seeing the hands-on lab you've put together for demonstrating this exploit.
Thanks for having me back. It's always good to be here.
And thank you. I also want to introduce Evan from Randori. And Evan, looking forward to seeing how you guys allow us to take a assume breach philosophy and mindset to this whole problem.
Awesome. Yeah. Thank you for having me. This is great.
All right, well, let's dive into this. First of all, we're just going to talk about what is Big IP in case you're not familiar with it. Then we'll dive into the details of the exploit. We'll see a demonstration, and then we'll talk about defense. So Big IP is an appliance, either virtual or physical. It does network traffic management, application security management, which is kind of a generic term, but it helps provide web application security. But sadly, it's in need. So it might be able to function, in some way as a web application firewall, but it sadly needs a web application firewall in front of it. Hey, Kev.
Yeah, absolutely right.
Anyway, sorry, had to take a shot. And load balancing and stuff like that. So it's not unlike the Citrix application delivery product. I guess in some ways, it's middleware. In fact, here, whether physical or virtual, it sits between your users and your web applications. And so it can do all kinds of URL, HTTP, SSL magic in between. And, break up a URL and say, oh, if it's this part of the URL, then it goes to this web server. If it's this part of the URL, it goes somewhere else, just on and on. But as such, of course, it is a major conduit in the flow of your most serious application traffic. And as with any IT product out there, it has a administrative plane. In this case, it's called the TMUI, the Traffic Manager User Interface. And so this is the logon screen to TMUI, but this is where an admin logs on to manage the appliance. And something I want to point out real quick here is, even though I'm showing you the logon screen of a Big IP appliance, this vulnerability is pre-authentication. So a bad guy does not need to successfully authenticate at all. He just sends a specially crafted URL and bam, he is in control of this appliance, which is sitting right in the middle of all of this traffic to and from your web servers and between your users. Now, the first question is, what is an administrative interface doing connected to the internet in the first place? And I think part of the thing is that F5 designed this and intended this. they coded it with the assumption that it was not connected to a hostile network. And I'm not excusing their failings, but I think it is important to acknowledge that they say, hey, this shouldn't be just connected to the internet. This should be on a out-of-band network leg that you can only access after having already authenticated through whatever means that your remote admins should. Evan or Kevin, any thoughts on that? The other big question is, or the other, I already brought that out. The exploit is pre-authentication. Go ahead, guys.
You're absolutely right. Like there are some things which you expect to be exposed to, like the internet-facing side, and there are some things you definitely don't expect to be facing. And this is becoming more difficult in the world we find ourselves in today with COVID-19, with a lot more people working like distributed and remote. We're finding that organizations are either deliberately or accidentally leaving these things open, not realizing the kind of impact that it could have, thinking that my engineer's now at home, I need them to be able to access this. Getting a VPN in place is going to be difficult, time consuming. So open the port, like it's authenticated. What's the worst that could possibly happen?
It's authenticated, and you can also configure this to use 2FA, and so you're like, we're golden. Username, password, and whatever my token is. If I don't have my token, you can't get in. Not so fast. We don't even have to authenticate here. So that's one of the sad things about 2FA. I love 2FA, but if the vulnerability is upstream from 2FA, it doesn't help you. Yeah, so let's see here. Let's just keep it moving. So this UI is just built from off-the-shelf typical web application stack. It's not PHP, but it's Tomcat, Java. I don't know what you call the stack in general, but it's basically, first of all, Big IP is a modified flavor of CentOS. The web server portion that runs TMUI is Apache. And then on top of that is Tomcat, which hosts Java applications. So next thing in the stack is Java, and then you have the actual TMUI application, mostly written in Java, but it's kind of a kludge of other stuff too, right? Perl scripts and something else?
Yeah, there's a lot of different tech stack in there underlying. So we found Perl scripts, PHP scripts, JavaScript applications for the front end, the Java applets, JSP. There's even some CGI and some compiled stuff in there as well. There's lots of different tech stacks all working together to drive the same front end.
Just for a admin user interface. All right, so I think that is a problem there. I mean, you've got to pick something to build your app out of, but every time you use another piece, you're dragging in and expanding your attack surface. What do you guys think of that as a statement?
I think it's true, and as organizations build out like you were alluding to in COVID-19, they're trying to figure out how to get these things. All of these products are adding to the organization's risk as well, right? So just like there's all these tools that are added, right, in this system to make this a product that's usable, organizations are adding more and more other products and kind of combining it all, right? The combinatorics of it starts to get pretty insane.
Also, there's a database component here, HyperSQL, and I haven't dove into this. I assume that HyperSQL is where your policies and configuration, everything that you do in Big IP through the TMUI, I assume is stored in HyperSQL. I could be wrong about that. If you guys know, please jump in. But I think another important thing here is HyperSQL is a published endpoint which I don't understand that either. There's, again, that's probably just from lack of diving into it, but if you guys can shed light on that, go for it.
Yeah, so HyperSQL's in there, and I think one of the really interesting things for me is when I first started looking at this, it's not the latest version of HyperSQL. This is another Java stack, and this one dates back to 2008. They're 1 point off, so 1 point release off another vulnerability, so that is patched, but there are newer versions of this that have existed since. So it's a strange thing not to update. I don't think it has everything. I think this one runs as an in-memory SQL manager, so I don't think it has all the keys, but there's definitely some critical data that's available in there.
And it's published as an endpoint addressable through URIs, through URLs, which perplexed me, but maybe there's JavaScripts that are asking for stuff from it. I don't know.
Yeah, so this is part of that distributed way they've built the things because they've got several different technologies. They're exposing like internal web APIs in order for the PHP to talk to HyperSQL, for the JSP to be able to talk to the PHP. They're exposing those endpoints, but they're not exposing them only on the internal plane. They're exposing them on the external. Yes,
that's a key point there. The other thing here is for authentication, they're using a PAM module, pluggable authentication module, and that's a good thing. That's the right way to do authentication in Linux. But I think important to this is that's where the logic for limiting which pages you can access without authentication is enforced. And every single one of these technologies or layers in the stack parses URL using different code and according to different rules. And that is one of the key factors in this whole exploit. So that PAM URL says, look, you can't access anything here unless you're authenticated except for TMUI login.jsp. And unfortunately, as you're going to see, some of the parsing logic only looks at that much of the URL, and if the URL begins with that, it passes it on up and allows that request to make it further up in the stack. The other thing that this exploit depends on is something called matrix parameters. And I would love to know, I wish I'd put a poll in. Maybe if Brendan has time, we'll do it. But before this webinar, how many of you knew about query parameters? And how many of you knew about matrix parameters? So query parameters are where you see the base URL and then a question mark and then the name of the parameter equals and its value. And if there's another parameter that's delimited by an ampersand, so we're saying parameter A is 1, parameter B is 6542. Well, guess what? There's a whole different type of parameter that's allowed within the path portion of the URL where they're denoted by semicolons. And that's a thing. And you might not even know about it, but there's code sitting there in most web technologies supporting it since it's part of the standard or at least proposed standard. And then you find out, since it's so uncommon, they kind of handle it in different ways. So you'll see where all this is going. Matrix parameters, sometimes called path parameters, but path parameters have kind of a new, that term kind of has a different meaning. Like this right here is something they call path parameters now. So we're at Stack Overflow, this is where this thing is discussed, but I'm just pointing out that this particular URL has what most people think of as a path parameter now. This is actually the surrogate ID of the question itself, and it's just showing up as though it's a folder in the path. Anybody getting ready to say something there?
I was going to say that's a good call out for any bug hunters out there that are watching this. Lots of these technologies are built on just general purpose web servers and stuff like that. And those web servers implement all of the spec generally. So there's all sorts of stuff that it does unintentionally, and if you don't know that it can do that, say you're a young developer or new developer, you don't know all of the things that a web server like that can do, so you don't even know to think that this could be a thing either when you're developing this. So
yeah, folks, so that makes sense. Evan was telling me right before the webinar you're messing with some device and you accidentally used the wrong verb and found out, and I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, so it was I was looking at an embedded device, and it had a web server that it implemented, and I broke the embedded device, it stopped working, and in trying to figure out what I did, I found I had accidentally done a put instead of a post, just in messing with curl commands, and it turns out web servers will take put as an HTTP verb and just write that file. And the way this web server was implemented, it just literally would take the put request and write whatever you gave it to that file. So I'd overwritten like a critical file on the system inadvertently. But it just goes to show you there are specs for these things, and the specs were pretty open back in the day. And the internet was new and security wasn't a thing.
Yeah, there's just a lot of functionality out there. So the evil URL in this case is you ask for TMUI, the IP address of the big IP appliance. We're going into TMUI, the Traffic Manager User Interface, and we ask for the login JSP page. And we're not authenticated, and that's fine, and that should put up that page that I showed you right back here. But they're adding on this other stuff. So ... okay, so we know this has got to have something to do with path traversal, semicolon. When I first saw that, I assumed, and wrongly so, that that was a command termination thing, but it has nothing to do with that. In this case, it's in a URL, and it is going to trigger some string parsing related to path parameters that I just talked about. And then we get another fragment of a URL, TMUI, local DB, workspace, file read, JSP, and a parameter, in this case a normal query parameter, asking for dun 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 dun, the etc password file, which is a list of all your user accounts. And so this is basically saying with a single URL, just coded up the right way, we can read any file on that system. And yeah, so how does all of this work? Going back to the application stack. So Matt says, wouldn't etc password be encrypted? Well, actually, etc password isn't even where the hashes are stored. It's not about whether it's encrypted. What we're showing here is that with unauthenticated access, if we can just send a HTTP request, we can download any file in the system. That's the point, Michael. It's not really about the etc password file. Do we agree, guys?
Yeah, the etc password file is one of the default things that we tend to go through, because if you can see that, then you know you've got some access across the system. There are some config files that you have read access to, and they can elicit a whole wealth of information, and we'll kind of see how this works in the demo in a bit. It is important to note that the file read and the file write, they are unprivileged, so they don't work at root level. So you can't read etc shadow, which is where the hashes might have been stored. You can't write to some of those places, but as we'll see later on, there are ways around that with this exploit.
Great. Also, that password here is generally used as a proof of concept because that file is just almost always there. If you're going against a Linux system, and you're just trying to prove that your file read actually works, Everybody on the system has access to read etc password because like they said, it's just the user list. It's not their actual password hash. And you have to have that information for the system to work. So that file is almost always there.
Great. All right, so this is just one example of what you can do. This exploit allows you to do lots of other stuff, run arbitrary Java code and other stuff. So there's quite a few, basically we can request and ask Tomcat to run any Java file in there. And some of those Java apps or servlets or whatever allow us to insert arbitrary Java code, right? I mean, this thing is pretty wide open in terms of its vectors.
Yeah. One more thing to point out here with the etc password is that one and etc hosts are the most common that people try to read to see if like a file inclusion bug like this works. So if you have logs, it's very unlikely that an application itself is trying to read etc password. So if you have logs and like alerting set up, maybe setting an alert on something trying to read etc password in a parameter like this is a good idea, because it's pretty unlikely that something will do this in practice, and it's generally someone poking at something trying to figure out if they can get access to stuff.
And while you're doing that, look for dots in incoming URLs too. But Kev?
So I was just going to point out, so you're currently showing this as a GET request, so we can see the parameters being passed in the URL. The application doesn't actually care whether you send it as a GET or a POST. So the file read, the file name parameter, the file content parameter, the things you're going to run, you can also send them as a POST request. And Apache by default doesn't actually log the contents of the post. It's one of the downsides to being able to inspect this. So making sure you're looking for those path injections as well as the other things is important. And this thing needs additional logging putting in front of it in order to detect those things, because you can go very blind very quickly.
Well pointed out. Okay, so here's the thing. As this URL comes in and gets passed from one level in the stack to the next, look what happens. And if you're interested in the nitty-gritty details, and if you actually want to see the code, for the most part, the C code that does this string parsing, I'm going to include in the follow-up email some URLs where you can dive into that. But here comes the original evil URL. That semicolon results in this getting passed on up the stack, but being removed, and then that semicolon gets interpreted as going up, and then you specify TMUI again, and you actually end up at the physical path of this file read JSP file and are able to grab that file. There's lots of other ways to do this, and I don't think it's worth in this webinar, unless you guys want to share a couple of details why exactly this happens, but the bottom line is that the reverse proxy module of Apache handles string parsing and the semicolons one way, Tomcat does it another, and just this arcane combination of components in the stack results in this being possible. Guys?
You're right. It's one of those things. It's something that's very hard to ever account for. So we know that when you're doing programming, you can run like code scanners. They're going to find if you're not properly parameterizing statements or not input validating. But these kinds of behaviors, they're native to the stack. They're in like Apache config files rather than in your application. So it's a very easy thing to miss and accidentally leave those things in there. Because like I said, some of these things we don't know it even exists. So why would you look for it? And where you've got your DevOps team which is sitting like separately to your developer team. So your developer team writes the application, but it's maybe the DevOps side of the house that's putting this full stack together. So like you have problems where the left hand might not necessarily know all the things that's happening on the right hand side. That can put you into these kind of positions that would be extremely difficult for a developer, even a seasoned developer, to spot this kind of flaw from existing.
Iona asks, is Big IP primarily used with a private VPN, so not a publicly available IP address? And quite the opposite, actually, Iona. This is usually your front door to web applications that are published to the internet. That being said, the component here, TMUI, is the administrative plane, the administrative console. That should definitely not be exposed to the internet, but thousands and thousands are. Thousands and thousands of instances and installations of Big IP are unfortunately exposed to the internet. And we've talked about that earlier in the webinar. Okay, so you see at the end of the day then, all this arcane little parsing logic and the sequence that it happens in results in you being able to arbitrarily specify any path you want to and request it. And if it's Java, then Tomcat's going to run it. So what should F5 have done, and what can we do? Well, this is a bad configuration, and like I said, the particular mix of components that you find here. First of all, F5 should be stricter with the parameters. And for instance, it appears that they changed one thing from, you know, HSQLDB anything to just HSQLDB. And that's, I think that that's a good overall rule. And that's part of what web application servers do, is we have to understand that URLs are complicated little beasts that the bad guys have figured out a million ways to mess around with and trick your web server into doing things you don't expect it to do. So whenever we're talking about which URL endpoints are allowed through, we need to really know what we're doing. And we haven't talked too much about HSQLDB. We've been focusing on login.jsp, but it's kind of the same thing there. At the end of the day, if they had just made absolutely sure that as far as the path portion of your URL, you could only request tmui/login.jsp, and that's it as far as the path, I think we would have been protected. You know, you need to parse URLs the same way. But in all fairness, how would an average web developer know and realize that reverse proxy component in HTTPD parses them one way, Tomcat does it another? I mean, there are pre-existing articles on all of this. There are articles that led the security researchers and put them on the trail of finding this. And this type of exploit is out there undiscovered in lots of other products. Again, if you've got a URL that is the entry point to your administrative plane, and there has to be a couple URLs that are allowed non-authenticated, like login.jsp, then it's not a bad idea to enforce that URL at multiple levels instead of just putting all your eggs in one basket. Also, now this one is just a gimme. Don't you guys agree? Block frequently abused character sequences like ...
Yeah, and this is one of the mitigations that they actually came out. So the F5 Big IP stack already comes with the ability to do this, to block these kind of attack sequences. So one of the when they first released this, to provide people with an alternative to obviously patching immediately is sometimes difficult, especially with these large appliances. So they gave us the mitigation, which was effectively if this sequence exists in the URL string, then ship it off to a 404 page. The important thing to notice there is that within about a week, we were seeing that people had found a way to bypass that initial mitigation. And then F5 came out with another mitigation. But yeah, so blocking those sequences, absolutely the right thing to do.
And you also brought up input validation with F5.
Yeah, so obviously when we see these big bugs hit, especially with these big applications, security analysts, like people who are interested, like bug bounty hunters, they start to take a closer look at what's happening under the hood. And input validation is a key thing from an AppSec perspective. Taking untrusted input from your users and like sanitizing it, making sure they're not doing naughty things, is a key part of that. And sadly, it's something that's missing through a lot of the F5 stacks. So as you look at a lot of their Java code, they're taking inputs directly from the URL and they're passing it direct to command constructions without validating any of the content in there. So there are some checks, and the way they're constructing those commands mean that it's not very easy to exploit them, but it's still a very bad coding practice because when we see techniques like this come along, you can start to chain those. So it might not be vulnerable now, but we might be able to chain that bad coding practice with something further down the line.
Now, what can we do? Because we don't have control over those decisions, and we have to buy technology products and deploy them. So, number one, any product that you've got, it has an administrative plane, restrict that to a trusted network. Enough said. So in real world terms, what do we mean? Well, there's a lot of ways you could do that. First of all, F5 already had long ago recommendations and articles in their particular case for how you make that application only available to specific IP addresses on that appliance, and it's only, so that it would only be published on certain IP addresses. And so you would ideally have an administrative network connection coming into that appliance, even through like VLAN maybe, and then that administrative network is only accessible through, additional controls, maybe a administrative jump box that it itself is protected by a firewall and dual authentication and, blah, 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 blah. It really depends on how you in your environment have set up your administrative portal. Maybe you're using privileged session management tools. That's a classic technology and classic technique that would protect you against things like this. Your administrative planes are all behind a hardened privileged session management solution. Also, sticking an application firewall in front of this. Application firewalls are very good at applying generic, well-known techniques against URLs to prevent this kind of thing. And of course, Evan, you're going to talk about monitoring. We've already brought it up a little bit. And just assuming that this technology, assuming not this, but all technology has these types of unpatched and unknown vulnerabilities. And you'll talk more about that, Evan, with kind of as a variation of assumed breach. So let's dive into some of that. First of all, we're going to go to you, Kev, and show us how this vulnerability actually looks. And I'll mention that you're using this very cool immersive labs platform that you've put together that allows people to come in and role play on just tons of vulnerabilities like this as either a red and or blue teamer, eh?
Yeah, so immersive labs, so we recognize that people want to be able to get their hands on this either as network defenders or as offensive teams. So what we do is we create a really safe environment where you can drop in to the Immersive Labs platform and you can jump into these environments where we've already set it up for you so that you can just jump straight into a lab. We've got all the tech stack in place. You can access this through a browser, so you don't have to worry about going through VPNs. And within a couple of minutes, like you can see here, we'll drop you into a Kali desktop environment. We'll give you a target that's private to you, and you can have a play with it. So I'm hoping that my screen is showing, and I'm hoping that I've prayed enough to the demo gods that this is going to go well.
You've got to sacrifice a small furry mammal. Sure.
Okay, so let me just... So what we're doing here is we're starting up this environment. So we're going to drop shortly into my desktop environment, and my target's actually going to take 2 to 3 minutes to come up. So Evan, if you're ready, it might be worth switching to you first while I wait for this environment to spin up.
Evan, can I make you the presenter?
Sure.
Or I'm going to have to filibuster for a minute and
let's...
You know, and I tell you what, while you're spinning up, Evan, I'm just going to throw a quick poll. Are you ready? Go ahead.
Well, let's do the poll, because it kind of makes sense for me to go after we talk about all of the details of the bug.
All right, sure. So I just wondered, folks, I bet most of you know about query parameters, right? And then I'm going to ask you the same question with regard to those weird matrix parameters. Let's see here. And we're coming up on, got to about a third voting, and it's still spinning up. And then I'll share the results with you here in a second. I'm not going to give a lot of time on this because most of you have already voted. Okay, we're at 50%. Closing that one, and then share the results. So let's just say 75% of you know what query parameters are. And I actually expected that to be higher, but maybe you have seen them before but just weren't knowledgeable in what they were called. But let's now go with this one. And I'm expecting this to be a lot lower. Oh, yes. So third, 41%, 45. When I hit 50, I'm going to go ahead and stop it, folks. All right, I'm going to close this off. So look at that. Makes me feel good anyway, because I never knew about these things. I bet you did, Evan.
Yeah.
I love that modest.
It's a key part, yeah.
Isn't that
well, I mean, there's
interesting?
a good point in here, though, right? This is mine and Kevin's job, right? I try to write exploit and find vulnerabilities and exploit them, right? This is what I do for work. Everybody else here doesn't do that, right? You're protecting a network. You're trying to make sure that your business remains operational in the face of all of these things, figuring out what the thing is to patch next and what all the work is that you need to do. Your job isn't to sit and read the HTTP RFC to try to spot weird spots where people, or like the myriad of HTTP or RFCs, I should say, to spot the weird corner cases that a developer is going to mess up on. And it's probably not to like reverse engineer out these embedded systems and figure out what's going on in them and appliances and all of these things and really understand all of this stuff. So this number actually makes a lot of sense to me.
Well, that's a good point, but I think it also speaks to both of what you guys do, and that is, Kevin, you give us blue teamers an opportunity to function as a red teamer and to think more along these lines because, you're basically a red teamer, right, Kev? And that's the way you think, and you know about this stuff. And so that's the thing that Immersive Labs gives us the opportunity to do.
You're absolutely right. So I actually started life as a blue teamer, so as a network defender. And then over the last several years, we've seen big booms in 0 days and like high target exploits and like lots of novel techniques. And we're not just talking like APT state sponsored stuff here. We're talking about like cyber crime gangs, even script kiddies picking up these techniques. So that's where I started to take a closer look at the red teaming side, look at the pen testing side, looking at the way the attacker works. If I understand normal, so what normal looks like from a network perspective, and then if I understand what the attackers are doing, that gives me a really easy way of correlating across logs. So knowing evil, finding normal, these are very important techniques to be able to do. And I think my network is almost back up, so the lab should be loaded and my big IP is up and running.
All right, I made you the presenter again. There you go.
Thank you very much. So like I said, obviously not enough praying to the demo gods, but the nice thing about the platform is it's very easy for me just to kickstart this lab again, wait a couple of minutes for the underlying network to spin up and drop me back into this device. So here we can see I've got this F5 IP address, and what I'm going to make sure is that I log out because, like you said, this is unauthenticated. So we want to prove that I'm logged out, and just to show how dangerous these kinds of attacks are.
So we have an actual big IP virtual appliance running here.
Yes, and that's why it takes a couple of minutes to spin up in the background. We're not spoofing anything. We're not pretending to be anything. We're giving you a real big IP appliance on a vulnerable version so that you can go in. You can. I'm going to show you some of the red team stuff so you can have a look at what that looks like. But also as a blue teamer, very early on we didn't know what kind of logging was available. So having this kind of environment available in Immersive Labs where I can just jump in, throw a Metasploit module at it, throw some URLs at it, and then go looking across the operating system because I have it there to look at those logs that are available so I can start to correlate on my own infrastructure to see what it's like.
By the way, you have an understanding audience here, Kevin. Simon says F5 users are used to reboots taking ages, Kev.
Good to know. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to jump into here. So as part of the lab environment we give you some details on like how you can identify this. So I'm just going to start, and we'll just start off using that same example you had before. So if I open a new tab, paste this in and grab my IP address. So what we can see here is, like I said, so this is how it tends to be exposed. And all we're doing here is we're hitting that login JSP, we're passing over the path traversal, and then we're hitting that internal tool. And if I hit go on that, we can see that I've grabbed this output. And if you're used to seeing this kind of thing, then you'll recognize this as being Etsy password. This isn't just straight file include. You can see there is some wrapping around this. What's actually happening is I'm using an internal function, this file read function. It's just I've got unauthenticated access to it.
And it's sending back JSON.
It's sending back a JSON object which contains my contents. Now, like we mentioned earlier, if I try to read the Etsy shadow file, I can see I've got permission denied. So this file read is only working at the same level as the tech stack is running on, which is an unprivileged user. But we'll see shortly there are ways around that. So file read is interesting and it's great and it's really powerful as an attacker to look for credentials. But what I'm looking for ideally is some kind of code execution. And we actually get this in a couple of different stages. So there is a command called tmsh cmd. Well, there's a thing called tmsh. TMSH is the command line tool which F5 Big IP uses when you want to administer it. If you want to create new accounts or anything like that, then that's the command line tool. To make things easier for its users, Big 5 put a web version of this into the front end, so you can access the TMSH command line from the web app. Now they have limited this, so you don't have full access to everything. There are only a handful of commands that you can use. So list, delete, and a couple of others. But some people who are far cleverer than I found a way that you could actually use that limited interaction you've got with the TMSH to actually alias bash. So that we'd end up running a full command injection. So whilst it was never designed to give us that access, and this is why we say understanding the attacker's perspective, understanding that they're going to go find those is very, very important. So if I try and run through a full demo here. So we've got file read we've just seen. So this one here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a file write. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to write a bash script into the operating system in a place that I'm going to be able to use it later on. And that's going to give me a lot of control. So I'm just updating my IP addresses because I had to restart this.
So is the bash script, the contents of the bash script actually in the URL, or are we telling it to go out and pull it from a staged place?
So you could do both. So what I'm doing here is I'm using a file write. So I'm saying I'm going to send the file contents inside the URL string. And again, I'm sending this as a GET request here, and I'll use curl to send it off. But you could also send this as a post request, which means that when you start to look at logs, you're not necessarily going to see all those logs coming back in. So I'm going to start a bind shell, and what my bash script is going to do when I get around to executing it is it's going to create a connection back to me. So I don't have to worry about firewalls. I'm going to tell that device to connect out to me.
So reverse shell.
So a reverse shell. So what I've done here, in the same way that I did from the browser, I hit that IP address, I hit that batch reversal, but I told it to write me a file in this area that's writable for me, and to write the contents of my bash script.
And the bash script says, could we just talk about that real quick?
Yeah, so this one's really easy. You can actually see the contents here. So this is just run netcat, attach it to bash, and then pipe that output back to my IP address on port 4444, where I'm hopefully going to catch the shell in there.
And netcat is just, it comes with every distro of Linux basically, right? And it's like a flexible pipe. You can connect it up to one port or one standard input output, and then twist it around and connect it to some other orifice is the best way to describe it.
You can, and so netcat's very powerful, and it comes with the ability to bind to something like bash. There are other versions where they've removed that functionality because it is a very large security risk, but you're right, it's pretty much de facto on all modern operating systems.
So he's living off the land here.
Yeah, so that's what we're doing. We're living off the land. So
I mean, with the exception, we have created this little file here. So if you're looking at file integrity monitoring, maybe you'd notice this file appearing.
Yeah, so the first curl command wrote my file. I've just run a second one just to read the file again, so that gives me confidence, and I can see that my file has been written there. And the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to use that tmsh command. And like we said, we've got a handful of commands. So create is one of the ones that's available to us. And what I'm going to tell tmsh to do is I'm going to say, create me an alias. And switch list, which is another command I'm allowed to run, and replace it with the command bash.
Are you serious?
Yeah. What I'm going to ask it to do is just replace the word list and replace that with bash. So then when I send this one off, I'll be able to then just run the list command, give it my bash script, and hopefully we should see that run.
So alias is one of the limited commands that are allowed.
Yeah, I think they hard code in a list of 5 that they're allowed to run. And alias isn't actually one we're allowed to use, but they're only checking that first command word, which should be either create, list, delete, and I can't remember this. So they don't check any deeper than that. They're only checking that top level. So we could chain as many commands together as we'd liked. We also have the ability to delete. So once I've created an alias, I can then delete it, switch it out for something else, and away we go again.
String parsing is I'm trying to think of a non-5-letter word, but string parsing's tough.
Yeah.
It is incredibly tough.
Especially if you have something like an alias command.
Yeah. And encoding and double escape, cherry on top encoding. And
yes, so my demo is going all kinds of wrong for me today. I'm not getting my reverse shell back. I'm just going to double check everything is written correctly. So there is now a Metasploit module for this, and the Metasploit module also says the same. These F5 big IPs are very unstable, so this TMSH command especially is very unstable. Okay, so let's see.
So it's saying your alias is already there.
Yeah,
and we've
so
actually seen this as well. There's like a bunch of like we were talking about earlier, there's a bunch of complexity to this system. So when you're adding these commands, it's kind of like passing messages back and forth in between all of these different stacks that are on here. And there is some sort of weird race here that makes this kind of unstable.
Yeah, so going to keep trying. So I'm just going to try writing a file again in case I got my IP address wrong. This is why we never do live demos.
Yeah, but this is why we do live demos, because
this is the life of
an
attacker.
Yeah, I mean, it
right?
also raises
It
point.
doesn't work. You don't know why it doesn't work. So there's a bunch of opportunity here for defenders to catch the attacker in trying to get these things to go. Sometimes it gets a little grandized, or I don't know what the exact word is, but like people think it is a lot easier than it is sometimes.
There we go.
bada boom.
So like we said, so it took me a couple of attempts, and like Evan rightly said, the more the attacker is going to do this, you're just going to generate a lot more logs. But as we can see, with a little persistence from the attacker, I've managed to gain access. And whilst the other commands ran as a low privilege user, TMSH CMD actually runs as the root user. So I've now got full root access to this appliance, and this entire thing is can now be bent to my will. For want of a better phrase, I can go really stealthy. I can create myself a legitimate looking account, and then back out, like deleting the files that I left on disk, deleting the aliases, and restoring the system. So I've now got permanent access to here. I can just SSH in at will, and I can do things like intercept all the traffic, modify traffic. So if I wanted to go destructive, that's very easy. But if I was a more determined attacker and you've got something that I want, this gives me a really, really deep level of access into your operating system.
I mean, we not just to the big IP, but the fact that the big IP is sitting where it's sitting it's probably got fairly unfettered access to some really important application servers, and probably beyond that because of lack of network segmentation, right? And also, let's just wait around for the right user to come along and log on, maybe grab their credentials and now be able to access those applications as a legitimate business user, and it just goes on and on.
Yeah, and we mentioned it briefly earlier about one of the things that we can do is to put monitoring in place. It's very important to note that the monitoring on F5 is actually quite poor. I think there's like it's a 10 or 20 megabyte limit to how much data it's actively going to record, and then it's just going to start overwriting itself. So again, as an attacker knowing this, it would be very easy for me to come in to do this and then just to send like a few hundred legitimate looking requests. So you might, as an analyst, you're going to see the noise, but you're not going to see any of the commands that I sent. I'm going to almost like anti-forensics myself to try and hide myself from you. So having some kind of third-party integration, something like an Elk Stack or Sysmon or Syslog, sorry, that's shipping these logs off to something else, some other centralized logging, is a key part of a defensive strategy.
And here, the thing I want to get across before we switch over to Evan, it's about time for us to do that, I think, Kevin, unless you got something else, is that, you know, the fact that you had a little bit of trouble here getting this reverse shell to work really points out the value of your training platform, in that it's not just, you know, a little web application saying, okay, type in the command that would allow you to do this. It's, you have to get it to work against the actual technology that is in question here. And you're given just enough hints to help you get to the next level, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So go ahead, finish up with your part, and let's move on to Evan. Kev, this is really cool. Do you want to just talk briefly about the platform?
Yeah, I can. So if I jump back out, so like I said, that was the offensive version of this lab. We also have the defensive version of this lab, where we go more into that logging. So we jump into those logs. We start to look at how you can identify whether an attack's been remediated or not. We map almost all of our labs to the MITRE ATT&CK framework, and you can see here that I'm not very good at doing my own labs, but you can track and see how our labs map across. So if your organization has some specific techniques that you want to protect against, then you'll find we've got fairly good coverage across a lot of those labs. We've got about a little over 800 labs in total, and we cover a wide range of skills. So we do core techniques like what is a reverse shell, how to use burp, how to use Linux command line. And one of the things we really specialize in is things like we've just seen. So when F5, when the Citrix, when the Salt Stack labs hit, we have a team who monitor the same threat feeds, and we go and we take those vulnerabilities, we take those exploits, and we turn them into labs, put them in our platform so that our user base can get their hands on. It's one thing reading about these things in an article, but actually having the ability to get your hands on a keyboard, play with these vulnerable devices, and like I said, from both an offensive and a defensive side, that's really where we focus our things. So, yeah.
And how soon did you had this particular lab for F5 out, like the next day that it was discovered, right?
It always seems to be a Friday, and I don't know why big vendors do these releases on Friday. It completely ruins my weekends. But yeah, so within a couple of hours of the notification going live, I was reading the mitigations. I had the appliance running locally so that I could start to test. And by the time Monday came around, this lab, as you saw it then, had gone through the build all through our QA cycles and then was published to all of our user base by Monday morning. So when they came on, they could immediately go and play with it.
And the reason this is such an awesome way to take your skills to the next level is you don't have to spend hours just setting up an F5 appliance. Maybe you don't know anything about F5 and, you know, where do I get it? Where do I get it installed before you even get to the point that you can start hacking. The part that isn't important is already there, ready for you. You just jump in when it gets fun.
Absolutely, that's what it's all about. Like we said, one of the Immersive Labs things is like hands-on keyboard, actually having the ability to play with these things, and not a mock-up, but the actual real appliances to see how they really behave is a key part of our offering.
Evan, how about we turn it over to you? And the thing that I think will be really interesting to folks with regard to what you're going to do is taking a look at how to deal with the fact that we've got these kinds of exploits just laying there ready for someone to come across. And, you know, with your service and technology, we can assume a breach and we can go out and say, you know, the most likely place where we're going to see something like this is here on this piece of technology. Maybe you didn't even know you had that piece of technology.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you. First up, that lab looks super awesome. I'm kind of jealous and I want access to all of them. Really what I kind of want to talk about with this bug is that like how do we handle, like you were saying exactly, how do we handle the fact that these bugs are out there, they exist, our organizations have assumed all of this risk, and then really, like Kev was saying, these all seem to happen on a Friday, and I'm sure everybody was in this same situation where it's just like panic mode for your organization. What does this CVE mean? Is this bug real? Does the bug affect me? Do I have systems that are affected by this? Where are they? Who manages them? All that kind of stuff. And I kind of think of that as a scramble, right? So it's thing gets announced. It's making a bunch of waves in the news. I don't know if someone has an exploit for this. I don't know what's going on in my or how it affects me exactly, and I got to figure that out. So kind of what we're pushing is this kind of movement from getting from being focused on vulnerabilities to and essentially like the find and fix methodology to really managing risk to your organization. So all of these devices, for me as an attacker, any device that you have on your network is a target. It's something that I can go after, that I can try to exploit. There may be a public CVE for that. A lot of times in my experience going against organizations that have pretty good patch management, there's not a CVE, so maybe I have to find and develop a capability to go after stuff. And I think it just a determined adversary is also in that boat. If they are coming after an organization, they are looking at all of the things that are targets and trying to figure out, maybe it's an F5, maybe it's some other vendor, what's the new squishy thing that I'm going to do a bunch of research on, find a bug, and exploit that. So really, and we found if you can get from this like find and fix, what's the most recent CV, let me patch it, to what's the risk to my organization when I put this on the network, then when a CVE gets announced for that thing, which inevitably it will, you're in a much better spot to figure out what you need to do to handle it. Do you need to call everybody in for emergency after hours to get something handled? Can it wait until Monday? All that kind of stuff. So how this works as an adversary is I go through what we call black box discovery. So I know something about your organization. Maybe it's a domain name, maybe it's an email address. And I start trying to figure out all of the entities that are on that make up an organization's perimeter, what service they provide, maybe you use an F5, all that kind of stuff. So I'm constantly looking for something like that if I'm targeting an organization, and then I'm just watching it waiting. Attacks are very opportunistic. Maybe there's a CV that comes out, maybe there's a bug that I find, maybe that kind of stuff, but it's not every day, and I don't just have, unfortunately, O'Day in my back pocket for everything. So Really, I'm watching and waiting. Maybe somebody makes a mistake and puts something up that has default credentials, something like that. And then once I've discovered all of these things, I'm prioritizing, just like an organization should be doing, but kind of from an attacker mindset is how interesting is this target? So is it like super old? Can I look at it and see, hey, this hasn't been updated for 5 years, or the CSS on this looks like complete garbage, for lack of a better word. This looks like it was made in the 90s, that kind of stuff. And then try to guess kind of business impact, but that's really for the organization to determine, right? I don't really know for sure what's going on in that, but it's kind of the prioritization game there, right? Figure out how tempting it is to me, and the organization figures out how interesting it is to them in product. Really combining the way offensive-minded folks are thinking about it and how the organization, because the organization knows how it truly impacts. I just know what looks interesting and what can be compromised, or what looks like it can be compromised. So let's take a look at what this actually looks like. So I think about it, I have kind of a stack rank list here of, or not stack rank, but just a list here of criteria that goes into how I think about these things. First up here is enumerability. So there's an F5, right? And that can range from, can I even tell that there's an F5 there? Maybe I can just tell it's an IP address, but then I can tell it's an F5. Maybe I can tell the exact version of the F5, or which is like the major version, the minor version, the patch version. And then that goes all the way to, can I detect something about the configuration that's going on with that F5? In this case, the enumerability of this F5 device is actually pretty low. I can't tell much about it other than it is an F5 and that it is the TMUI interface. I can't tell if it's patched, or maybe this has been mitigated, that kind of stuff. So that leads into weaknesses. So is there known disclosures and exploits about this? So in this case, this bumps it up because I know that there are weaknesses in this thing, and that there is a history of weaknesses leads me to believe that there's probably a future of weaknesses. It's not always the case. Sometimes someone finds a weakness and then it's good to go. This particular with the F5 device, it seems like now that we know about a weakness, there's probably going to be more coming. So kind of interesting there. Then we take into account applicability. So how many of these exist just in the world? If this is all over the place and I'm an attacker, it might be super interesting for me to be able to develop a capability in this, because I can now exploit thousands of devices. If there's one of them, then it's maybe less interesting depending on my objective, but generally, the more there are, kind of the more interesting it is, because it's out in the world. And here for applicability, this one's actually kind of medium, because the actual management interface from our experience from scanning our customers is not really exposed that often to the public internet. We have a lot of F5 big IP devices in our platform that we've scanned. They're like in the thousands, and we found one where the TMUI was actually exposed. So kind of an interesting point there. And then research potential. So this is what we were talking about earlier, where this is like the F5 is a general purpose computer. It's just a Linux system sitting there, and all of the tools on it are just common software, Apache, Java, all that kind of stuff. So as an attacker, I want to know what the environment is going to be like, and if there is research for this already, what I'm going to have to try to figure out how to research. If it's like some super custom embedded web service that someone wrote by hand that no one's ever seen, it's more work for me and more cost for me. So really the research potential is the more I can have access to existing software and that kind of stuff, the easier it is to do research against it. So here, this one, like we've been saying before, is pretty high. It's a CentOS box with Java and Perl and awk and bash scripts and lots and lots of stuff there. Then we have post-exploitation potential. So this is what type of environment I'm going to get into if I land. This is pretty close with research potential, but it just really what's going on here is when I exploit something, how likely am I going to be able to be on a system that I know anything about, that tooling is going to work on. So Windows and Linux boxes is really high here because all of like implant tooling and network communication tooling and all that kind of stuff is going to work on here. Something like RTOS, where there is no real user LAN, you can't do the live off the land and all that kind of stuff. You have to bring in all your own tools. It's going to be less tempting because it's just more work. For the F5 here, like we already kind of covered, that Linux box is going to be pretty high. And then we have criticality. So that is how likely is this device used to protect some sort of security boundary? Meaning, if I compromise this system, am I going to get a perspective into the environment that is different than what I see? So say you have this F5 sitting on your perimeter. I am from what I call the internet perspective. I could just see everything that you can see from the internet. If I compromise this F5 system, how likely am I to see other sensitive information or other sensitive systems behind that F5 for that organization? So a classic example of this is like a VPN. I can see that VPN from the internet, and then once I've compromised that VPN, I can see whatever systems that VPN has behind it, user workstations, servers. Hopefully there's network segmentation, but most of the time I can see kind of everything from the VPNs. So those are generally interesting. So this is generally used on some sort of boundary there. And so this is rated pretty high critically. I feel like I went on there a lot. Any input, questions, that kind of stuff there?
Yeah, let's see here. One of the folks asks, with regard to monitoring, what should an ideal monitoring solution entail? Logging posts and doing file integrity monitoring on the appliance itself, or, what are your thoughts on that, Evan?
For monitoring your own logs, system logs, yeah, it's going to be kind of, you want to watch for things that are out of the ordinary. So, which is, it's a tough nut to crack sometimes. So like we showed in that request parameter, the Etsy password, if you see that in the HTTP request, that's generally not a great sign. File integrity monitoring is really good. I really like network monitoring. So if I were to compromise this F5 big IP, the Moose, our CTO, likes to say, and then what? I need to find everything out about the environment after the fact. So monitoring on the inside for network scans and that kind of stuff is actually really interesting and valuable tool that I've had used against me, right? Really effective in catching me. If I land on this system as an attacker, now the game has flipped. I now have to discover everything about the environment, and I'm completely blind and I don't know any information about what's going on. So I have to explore the network. We call it situational awareness. I'm trying to find out like what other things I have access to. That's a lot of DNS lookup and ping scans and port scans and all that kind of stuff from these devices. So just like we saw in Kev's demo, sometimes the first attempt doesn't work, so you have to poke at it a couple times. So seeing those in the logs is good. And then once it does work and I'm on the system, I have to discover all of the things that this can do or what this can get access to in the environment and reach out to it. So watching for something like, say you have a file share, if your F5 tries to SMB list the file share, it's probably a thing that should trigger an alert somewhere.
So Evan, Jonathan is just wondering, what does your service look like from a footprint and rollout point of view? Is it a matter of, here's our IP address space and our DNS space, and go ahead and take a whack at us, or what?
Let me actually, I have one more slide here. So we do have a free trial, but how our service actually winds up looking, it's kind of split into two things. So there's the reconnaissance view, which is if you just want to get a view of what your perimeter looks like from and stack ranked in that way that I was describing, like from an attacker looking at everything and doing target temptation on all of that, and looking at all that kind of stuff. We have what's called Randori Recon. There's a free 14-day trial. This winds up with a UI where you have a stacked ranked list of all of the targets that we're able to discover. You can see why we find them tempting. I don't have any more screenshots in my slides, unfortunately, but there's an area there where you can have input on what impact that has on your organization. So there's kind of a give and take between the red and blue team in that case. And then kind of like what you would expect, you can see, so I said there's targets. That's the actual instance of something. I describe it like this. There's Apache, which is a software, right? That's what we have listed as a service, just that you use Apache. And then that there's a specific Apache at a specific IP address with a specific host name that I can get to is a target. So we kind of have them broken up like that. And then you can see we have host names and IP addresses and networks. Additionally, we have the attack product, which then lets you authorize things in scope, and it's essentially like a scoping engine. So all of those targets, you can say, yes, go ahead and go after this. And then anytime we weaponize or have any of these bugs ready, we'll just start trying to attack it if it's authorized. And you can see if that bug's actually applying to your environment with that vulnerability. And then also, are my logs catching anything? Are my alerts going off? When it tries to do the next step, which is the scans from having landed, do I get notifications of that kind of stuff?
Gotcha. Let's see here. Let's go to Q&A then. Here's one for you, Kev. Is there a cost to use these labs? Well, obviously, but there is a special opportunity on this lab or on this exploit, Kevin?
Yes, so these are a commercial offering. So we have a couple of different offerings. So we have a Tech Vets offering and a Digital Cyber Academy. So if you're a military veteran or if you're in full-time education, then a smaller portion of the platform is available to you at no cost. So there's 200 or 300 labs, I think, available in there. The main bulk of our offering is a commercial offering. It's an enterprise product. But like I said, for this event, we do have both the offensive, the defensive, and some other labs available on our light mode. And I believe we have some links somewhere in the wrap-up that'll go out that people will be able to go there and get hands-on with these for a limited time.
So I'm a student of life. Would that qualify me?
Sadly not.
Let's see here. Matt has a question. First of all, no, I like one thing that Scott brought out. He says, our job, as IT security folks, is a mile wide and an inch deep, and that is the absolute truth. Matt says, how did you determine which commands you're able to run? Remember those 5 commands on TMSH, I think. Did you have to try every single one, or did you look in the configuration, or what?
So originally, I'm lazy and I go for speed. So originally it was just a case of trial and error. So because I was running my own appliance, I didn't have to this blind. So I was SSH'd onto the appliance while I was hitting the web request, and I was looking at I was looking at the Catalina log file, which is really verbose when you hit errors. And I kept seeing that some of the commands were blocked. At that point, I started to take a more proactive approach, and I grabbed some of the Java applications, some of the Java files. I pulled them back to my local machine, ran them through a quick decompiler, which gets me very, very close to the original source code, and then I can just track all of the URL calls through there. And that's where I found the hard-coded list of 5 commands. It was actually the guys who put the Metasploit module together, the guys at Rapid7. It was actually, they were the first people I saw that were actually tying that chain together. So the alias, the file upload, and the file save. I don't know if they were the first, but that was the first place I saw it on their Attacker KB platform.
Awesome. Let's see here. Oh, now I love this question. Aaron says, do you think that this type of vulnerability is prevalent in cloud-based services platforms in general, and specifically in things like big IP virtual editions? And I would like to weigh on that first, and that is lots and lots of the technology you see is just lifted and shifted to the cloud. The other thing is, I think you're seeing more and more junk directly accessible to the internet because of the cloud, because when you stand something up, by default, it's on the internet. It's like anything you stand up in the cloud, you have to take extra steps to put it, restrict its administrative interface to a secondary virtual network that you create, and then you've got to open up your own portal for securely accessing that administrative network. And I think the cloud is encouraging us to go the course of least resistance and just hang everything off the internet. I mean, it's the same thing with cloud storage. You have a S3 bucket on Amazon that is only really needs to be accessed by a certain web application, yet it's out there with a URL available to the whole world if you've got the right storage key. That's the only thing standing between you and this storage. But I'll get off my soapbox. Evan or Kev, thoughts on that?
So
I agree 100%. Really, I think of the cloud as just someone else's computer. It's still a computer, and everyone's computer, like everything I'm talking to, is generally someone else's computer. So it's really just another computer somewhere. Additionally, the cloud makes it so much easier for people to stand up this infrastructure. Yeah. So not only is it kind of stood up by default in a weird, insecure state, so this F5 specifically, I know at least one cloud provider, it was like a week later, you could still just, the default one was still vulnerable and unpatched and just open wide to the internet. And then kind of anybody that has access to that button to click it can now stand that up and attach it into your environment. And that's a pretty scary thing.
Yeah, the instance we're running as part of our lab is the default AWS virtual appliances provided by F5 Big IP straight into the AWS marketplace. And if anybody's familiar with the update process for the virtual appliance, it's not a fun thing to do. A lot of modern software, you can update it in part. So you can update like specific parts of the application. To update an in-place F5 appliance requires you to download a 2.5 gig ISO to your local machine, upload that through the TMUI interface to your remote machine, and then deploy an entire 2.5 gig image. It's not a fun thing to be able to replace. It's not the greatest patching policy in the world or the patching ability in the world. But yeah, these default virtual appliances, we saw exactly the same thing with Citrix, AWS, Azure marketplaces. It took them several weeks, like Evan said, it took them several weeks to get their vulnerable versions down and get the correct images in their place.
Sheesh.
And that's why we think the dynamic nature of enterprises now, that people can just stand this stuff in the cloud and attach it up to a thing, really makes black box discovery and network monitoring, like perimeter monitoring, super important, because anybody can stand this up at any time in an organization, and kind of the old school way of, hey, I'll scan you every 6 months so you can hit whatever compliance is just not helping in that situation.
Yeah, and the promise of the cloud unloading a lot of security burden from you is a very mixed delivery. It really depends upon the service that you're using. So let's see here. Who says, hey, more of a shout out than a question, but he says, I'm already using Immersive Labs. I can't recommend it enough. It's a great tool. Matt wants to get ballpark pricing on both of your solutions for a team. I'll let you guys contact him separately. Charlie asks, is it likely that a more thoughtful SE Linux profile would have contained the admin shell? What do you think about that?
It's possible, but so F5, it's a read-only file system by default, so it's actually very hard to manipulate things, and it took us a couple of attempts to find somewhere that was writable where we could actually stage the payload. So I think like temp/run/common were the only places. The TMSH command itself bypasses a lot of that, so SE Linux might prevent some of that further deeper exploitation, but it wouldn't have stopped the initial ability to gain a foothold.
One of the reasons something like this is super tempting to an attacker is you don't have shell access to this system, if I'm not mistaken. You have the like F5 shell, right? That when you SSH into it, you don't actually just get a shell on that system. So doing something like updating the SE Linux profile is going to be really hard for a user to do. You essentially have to reverse engineer it and figure out how to exploit it to get a shell on that. So
yeah, and one of the things we can do is we can just, using the TMSH command line, we can create our own admin account with our own password. Then we can gain admin access to that application, and then we can use the built-in functionality of it. So that built-in TMSH command, that built-in CLI command, those file reads, those file writes. So the shell is the somewhat sexy way that pen testers like to get in. It's what you're going to see attackers using, because they can script and automate that. But if you're a very targeted attacker going after this, they're probably going to go with something like create themselves a backdoor admin account and use that with like living off the land binaries, living off the land techniques, to avoid writing those logs as much as they can to stay under the radar.
Indeed. Matt says, are both offerings SOC 2 compliant? Kevin first.
We don't have SOC 2 compliance. We are currently going through ISO 27001.
Understandable. You guys are both pretty new. Randori, what about you, Evan?
We are building towards that as well. We're going through compliance stuff as we speak, but we are not currently.
Fair enough. Matt, do you offer any modules focused on Linux hardening? Second question, would removing tools on production systems like Netcat be advisable? I love that last question, and I'd be very tempted to do it. Just make sure that something doesn't break when you do that. Especially
with F5 Big IP. So one of the things they do is there's a JSP endpoint which calls a Perl script, which calls a bash script, which calls ping and awk and netcat. So you could have done all of that in the Java stack, but like removing some of those core things, like you just said, there is a danger that tool is used somewhere. So I would err on the side of caution if you're going to go down that path. You also have the issue that if you have a supported system and you make those kind of modifications, you may put yourself out of support. And as soon as you upgrade, it may reverse all of that. And I mean, it's a rabbit hole to go down. The big thing is to get those admin portals off onto a bastioned network and then monitor and go after it with stuff like Randori. But, I mean, you're definitely thinking along the right lines, Matt, especially with any system that you have control over. Matt says F5 owns, I don't know how you Linux nerds pronounce this, NGINX. That's making me nervous. Which was but it's strikingly strange that I wasn't aware of that fact, but they're using Apache rather than their own product. It's a very strange way of putting their own tech stack together.
Well, Dan, I think Big IP was an acquisition, wasn't it? Or maybe not. That accounts for that kind of thing a lot.
Or maybe before they had this as a product before Nginx was a thing, which is how I always said it, Nginx. I don't know if that's right.
That's how I say it.
Sounds good to me.
One of those that I've said in my head a bunch, but I've never actually said out loud, I don't think. So
let's see here. I want to be with the cool kids. Okay, so let's see. To finish up, so Evan, you've given us a great way to follow up there, 14-day trial. Do you have a final, where people could go to play with Immersive Labs, Kevin, slide, if we change back to you real quick before we sign off?
I don't have it on me. Immersivelabs.com or light.immersivelabs.com. Both those places will get you where you need to be.
Scott confirms Nginx is the way to do it. Okay, well, and we'll provide these links to both you guys in the follow-up email too. But you both have really cool secret sauce. Thanks for showing it to us. And thanks for making this awesome session available today.
Thanks for having us.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you.
All right, guys, take care. We'll be in touch again soon. And bye-bye for now.
that's really awkward.
Hey, we're all technologists here.
It's okay. I'm just going to kick this lab off again.